Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name's Anne, but I also go by my nickname Nini. I like to focus on Midwest true crime because I'm a Minnesota farmer's daughter. Today we're going to go to Minnesota and talk about a serial killer who terrorized the Twin Cities for about a year and a half. This case was requested by CJB, and thank you so much for suggesting it because this is a case I have known about, but I kind of feel like a dodo because I forgot that it occurred in Minnesota. What makes this case unique is after almost every one of his attacks, the killer called 911, and in those phone calls, he's expressing remorse for what he did. He's crying and very weepy, and it's because of those phone calls that he became known as the Weepy Voiced Killer. Paul Michael Stephani was born on September 8th, 1944 in Austin, Minnesota. He was the youngest of 10 children in a very strict Catholic family. When Paul was 3, his parents divorced and his mother remarried. Paul's stepfather was awful. He not only beat the children over little things like if they were in his way, but he also threw them down the stairs. When Paul graduated high school, he moved to the Twin Cities and bounced from job to job. He claimed to have epilepsy and blamed that condition for him being fired from those jobs. In 1970, he married Beverly Leiter, and they had a daughter a couple years later, but divorced in 1975. Paul basically abandoned his daughter. He became violent after that divorce and was convicted of aggravated assault, but the details of what exactly happened there are not known to the public. He started dating a woman who had moved to Minnesota from Syria. Paul was deeply in love with her, but after 4 years of being together, she had to return to Syria for an arranged marriage that her parents set up. So things were not going good for Paul. He was divorced, he kept getting fired from jobs, and now this woman that he was deeply in love with left him to marry another man. While this is pretty much all that's known about Paul leading up to when he started attacking women, it is thought that these disappointments in life are what led Paul to do what he did. On December 31st, 1980, 20-year-old Karen Poac was walking home from a nightclub around 1 a.m. in St. Paul. Karen was a college student at the University of Stevens Point. She was on Pierce Butler Road when Paul, who was 36 at the time, pulled over and offered her a ride. It was a December night in Minnesota, so it was pretty cold out, and Karen wasn't wearing a jacket, so she took Paul up on that offer. She got in and drove to the Malmberg Manufacturing Company. Paul used to work there as a janitor, but had been fired in 1977. He parked the car, SA'd Karen, and then brutally beat her with a tire iron. He hit her between 20 and 30 times, and he beat her so bad that part of her brain was exposed. Paul left Karen lying nude on the ground behind the building. Around 3 a.m., Paul called 911.
Yes, please, this is an emergency. Please send a squad to Pierce Butler Road, Malmberg Manufacturing Company, machine shop. Please, there's an ambulance too. There's a girl hurt there.
Can you tell me what happened to her?
Just hurry, she's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks, by the edge here. Hurry.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you?
Police went to the location and found Karen there. She survived the vicious attack, but was left with permanent brain damage, and she couldn't remember anything about the attack. Flash forward a few months, and on June 3rd, 1981, 18-year-old Kimberly Compton hopped on a bus in her hometown of Pepin, Wisconsin. She had recently graduated high school and was excited to start the next chapter of her life. She left a note for her grandfather, who she lived with, and said, quote, "The reason I'm leaving you isn't because I'm ungrateful for your taking me in. It's because there isn't anything in Pepin for me, and it'll be easier to get a job in a bigger area. I'm taking the bus so you won't have to worry about me." Unquote. She arrived at a bus stop in downtown St. Paul and then went across the street to Mickey's Diner to get some food. As she sat in a booth eating, Paul was eating in a booth nearby. He saw she was alone, walked over and started talking. Kimberly told Paul she had just arrived in the city and didn't know her way around. He offered to drive her around and show her St. Paul. They finished their meals and then left the diner together. Paul drove her to an area near Superior and Oneida Streets, saying it had a good view of the Mississippi River. But once there, he immediately attacked Kimberly. Afterwards, he called 911.
Oh, you find me? I just picked somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody.
Hello? Are you there?
About half an hour after that call, some boys were playing near a wooded area where an interstate bypass was being constructed. Their ball bounced into some bushes, and when they went to pick it up, They saw what they thought was a dummy laying there, but they quickly realized it was a person and called the police. It was the body of Kimberly Compton, but she didn't have any ID on her, so she couldn't immediately be identified. She had been stabbed 61 times in the stomach, chest, and inner thighs. She also had been strangled with a shoelace. Police found a key in Kimberly's pocket that led to a locker at the bus depot, and there they found her bags and were able to identify her. When Kimberly's autopsy was performed, they found undigested barbecue beef in her stomach. They noted that Mickey's Diner was close to the bus station, and they saw that on the day that she was murdered, barbecue beef was the special. So they put 2 and 2 together to kind of retrace her steps and figured when she arrived at the bus depot, she had then went to Mickey's Diner. Police talked to the staff at Mickey's Diner to see if they saw Kimberly talking to anybody, but they couldn't remember anything. 2 days after Kimberly's body was found, Paul called 911 again, but this one wasn't recorded. However, they were able to trace it to a phone booth near a bus depot. I'm not sure if it was the same bus depot Kimberly had been at, but by the time they got there, Paul was gone and multiple people had used the phone, so there was no witnesses to narrow down who had used the phone to call 911. Police did at first think the phone calls regarding Kimberly's murder were prank calls, but Paul had mentioned stabbing Kimberly with an ice pick on those phone calls, and that detail had not been released to the public, so that made them think it really was the real murderer calling in. On June 11th, Paul called police again.
Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. I am so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every night. I can't believe it. It seems like a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
Police wondered if maybe he had called in on other murders, so they looked through unsolved murders and attacks to see which ones had received phone calls, and that led them to Karen Poac's case, and they linked those two together. Police released portions of the phone recordings to the public, hoping that somebody would recognize the voice.
We're hoping that somebody will recognize the voice, whether it be a friend or a relative or a neighbor or someone you work with or drink with.
It does sound like they did receive a lot of tips from that request, but none of them panned out. The media dubbed Paul the Weepy Voiced Killer due to the whiny way he talked in the phone calls and how he cried. If it wasn't for the brutality of what he did in his attacks, the phone calls would almost be funny because he is so whiny in them.
I keep killing somebody else.
At this point, police did consider Paul a serial killer, even though he had only killed one person at this point, but it was pretty obvious he had tried to kill Karen. St. Paul police reached out to the FBI for help. A profiler said the killer was going into a juvenile state on the phone calls and felt it was somebody who enjoyed playing cat and mouse games. They also noted that Karen and Kimberly had both been wearing red clothing when they were attacked. I'm not sure what piece of clothing Karen was wearing that was red, but Kimberly was wearing a red jacket. Paul even mentioned red clothing in one of his phone calls. Police issued a warning to Twin Cities residents to not wear red clothing. A few months after Kimberly's murder, police went to the home of 26-year-old Alan Lopez, where he was holding his parents and his sister hostage. They set up a phone line to negotiate and talk to him. As they talked, Alan told police he had killed Kimberly Compton. Alan had a long history of mental illness and assault. When police finally got into the house, Alan had killed his parents and sister, and he was arrested. Police tried to find evidence that would confirm that Alan was the Weepy Voiced Killer, but they couldn't find anything to connect him to Karen or Kimberly's attack. They did a voice comparison of his voice and the recordings, and it wasn't really a match. In February 1982, Alan ended his own life while he was in jail. Police had received no more phone calls from the Weepy Voiced Killer during the time that Alan was in custody. And even after his death, it was months before they received another phone call. So police thought, well, maybe he really was the Weepy Voiced Killer. On August 5th, 1982, Paul met 40-year-old Barbara Simmons at the Hexagon Bar in Minneapolis. Barbara was a nurse and described as caring and friendly. She knew everyone in the neighborhood. Paul went up to her in the bar and asked if she had a cigarette. Barbara gave him one and they talked for a while. Paul then offered to give Barbara a ride home. Before leaving, she told a waitress, "He's cute. I hope he's nice since he's giving me a ride home." The next day, a paperboy walking near 29th Street in Minneapolis discovered Barbara's body on the banks of the Mississippi River. She had been beaten and stabbed multiple times, and her wounds were circular, so it's thought she was stabbed with an ice pick or a screwdriver. On Paul's phone call after Barbara's attack, he says that he stabbed her 40 times. I did read one report that Barbara was 100 times, so I'm not sure which one is accurate. But even 40 times is a lot of times. Just think how long it takes to stab somebody that many times over and over. Paul was a very violent man. It did appear Paul had tried to get rid of Barbara's body and throw her into the river, but some brush had stopped her from getting into the water. Also, a kind of interesting note, the Hexagon bar where Barbara encountered Paul was set on fire and destroyed during the riots that followed the murder of George Floyd in 2020. 2 days after Barbara's body was found, Paul called 911.
Fire emergency.
Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly, Compton was the first one over safe. I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm sick. I'm going to myself, I think.
Where are you?
If somebody dies with a red kid on, it's me. I killed both of them. I'll never make it to heaven.
Calm down.
Police now realize that Alan Lopez could not have been the Weepy Voiced Killer because he was dead at this point. They looked through mugshots of about 150 criminals who had committed violent crimes in the Twin Cities area, and then they narrowed that down to 8 mugshots based on witnesses' descriptions from people at the bar who had seen Barbara talking to Paul. Paul was one of those mugshots since he had been arrested for aggravated assault, and he matched the description. When a detective was looking into Paul's background, he found Paul had also been arrested for fondling a woman who was wearing a red robe. He apparently had went up to her, said that he really loved her red robe, and then put his hands on her. This caught the detective's attention because all the other women had been wearing red clothing too. Barbara was wearing red pants when she was attacked. They also found out that Paul had worked at Malmberg Manufacturing, where Karen had been attacked. When they showed the mugshots of the 8 men to witnesses, they identified Paul as the man who was with Barbara. So everything was pointing at Paul as being the Weepy Voiced Killer. He became the prime suspect and police put surveillance on him. On the night of August 20th, 1982, Paul left his apartment and drove into downtown Minneapolis. Police had him under surveillance at this point, but when Paul got into the city, they lost track of him. He picked up 19-year-old Denise Williams, who was a sex worker. He brought her back to his apartment, paid her for sex, and then started to drive her back downtown. But Denise became suspicious when he didn't go in the direction of downtown. He parked on a dead-end road, pulled out a screwdriver, and started stabbing Denise over and over. She saw a glass bottle in the car and started hitting Paul over the head with it, and he got several cuts on his face. A man who lived nearby heard Denise screaming, so he came running over to help and saw that Paul was stabbing her. He yelled at Paul that he was going to call the police, and this caused Paul to run off. Paul went back to his apartment, but he was bleeding pretty bad from the cuts he had received, so he called 911.
I need an ambulance.
Where?
1505 Westminster.
What's the problem?
I'm all cut up. I got beat up.
What's your apartment number?
208. I'm bleeding.
208. Where are you bleeding from?
From my arm, my face, my head.
He was still under police surveillance, so when the ambulance showed up at his apartment, that caught the attention of the police who were sitting outside. Denise had been brought to the hospital. She had received about 15 stab wounds, but she survived. When police showed her a mugshot lineup, she picked out Paul as the person who had attacked her. And finally, Paul Stefani was arrested. During his interrogation, Paul denied having anything to do with any of the attacks. He insisted that the cuts on his face were because he had been beaten and robbed. A detective pulled out the Weepy Voiced Killer case file and showed Paul some of the pictures of the victims. Paul stood up and said, "You're not going to pin those on me." When he did this, his voice had changed and had become a little bit more high-pitched, and detectives were like, "Wow, that sounds like the voice on the recordings." Police did feel Paul had killed Kimberly Compton and attacked Karen Poac because those had received the exact same phone calls, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with those attacks. Denise and the man who had come to help her had both picked out Paul's photo out of a lineup, and the witnesses who had seen Barbara in the Hexagon bar with him had also picked out Paul from a lineup. But the only thing they had on Karen and Kimberly to link their cases to Paul were the phone calls, and a judge ruled them inadmissible because the crying and high-pitched voice made his voice distorted, so you couldn't say without a doubt, yes, that was Paul Stefani on all of the phone calls. Paul's ex-wife and his own sister testified that they felt it was Paul on all of the phone calls, but that still wasn't enough. So Paul was charged only with attacking Denise Williams and murdering Barbara Simmons. Paul pled not guilty, and his trial started in 1984. Caroline Lowe was a Twin Cities crime reporter. She's kind of a well-known Midwest crime reporter because she also was involved heavily in covering the Jody Huisentruit case in Iowa. She said during the trial, Paul sat there with a glare on his face and just seemed to have disdain for everybody. Paul was found guilty of the attempted murder of Denise Williams and the second-degree murder of Barbara Simmons. He was sentenced to 58 years in prison. In 1997, after 12 years in prison, Paul was diagnosed with terminal skin cancer, and they gave him only about a year to live. He reached out to police and said that he wanted to confess, but he only wanted one thing in return, and that was a picture of his mother's gravestone. Once he got that picture, he sat down with police and officially confessed to attacking Denise Williams and murdering Barbara Simmons. He also confessed to attacking Karen Poac and murdering Kimberly Compton.
Killing seemed to be the thing you were supposed to do. That was part of life. Driving the car was part of life. Eating food was part of life. To me, it seemed like killing was part of life. Until I did it, then I just couldn't turn myself in. That's why I kept getting on the phone. Will you catch me and stop me? She got in my car and I gave him my jacket until I said, the heat will be on in a minute. I had to clean some of the ice off the windshield.
Do you remember where you hit her with the tire iron, Paul?
I did.
Did you hit her 1 time, 2 times?
Must have been like 30 times, but I mean, a good 20 times I think it was.
Were you swinging it this way, or did you poke her with it? Or do you
I don't think I poked her. No. I remember just hitting her mainly on the forehead, on the cheek, and the jaw, the mouth, and the top of the head. And I think it was only about 10 times, because then I know you must really be hurting in that, with a steel bar like that. I was even hurt. When I went back to the car, I was going like this. I mean, and that's what made me want to go to the phone. I mean, I really wanted to help her. My mind started clearing up. What are you doing? You had a chance to make another friend, I kept yelling at myself. You like to make friends. And then that's when she started telling me where she was from, in Wisconsin and all. And I said, well, say, why don't you, I'm not even thinking about hurting her right now. I said, hey, why don't you let me show you around town? I said, yeah, I want to show you something. There's really a nice view over here. You see the nice river. I think I mentioned somebody you can probably have something to tell your parents about them. But as I walked out of the car, I carried my knife with me. I had every intention to hurt me. We lay down in the grass, and I remember opening up her bra and everything, just feeling stuff, and they just started stabbing me.
But what shocked police is Paul also confessed to murdering 33-year-old Kathleen Greening, and that totally caught them off guard. There had been no phone calls received after her death, so he wasn't even on their radar. Back on July 21st, 1982, in between the murders of Kimberly Compton and Barbara Simmons, a friend of Kathleen's, Carol Kellogg, drove to her apartment to pick her up because they were going on a vacation. Nobody answered when Carol knocked, so she let herself in. She called out for Kathleen, but there was no response, so she went from room to room looking for her. And to her horror, when she got to the bathroom, she found Kathleen lying face up in a tub full of water. The coroner had been unable to determine if Kathleen had drowned accidentally or if it had been homicide, so her cause of death was ruled to be undetermined. But police had been suspicious that it was murder, but they were thinking it might have been her ex-husband. When Paul confessed, he couldn't remember her name. All he said was that she had drowned in a bathtub, and he gave some details about her apartment. Police looked through unsolved cases from around that time period of people who had drowned in their bathtubs, and that led them to Kathleen. Details that Paul had given about her apartment matched up with her apartment, and he also gave them some details that only the killer would know, so they knew he had been responsible for her murder. Paul and Kathleen had dated several times, so that kind of surprised me that he didn't remember her name. This attack was different from the other attacks because Paul had known Kathleen, and it sounds like he really had feelings for her. So that could be maybe why he didn't call police after her murder. When Caroline Lowe interviewed Paul in prison, he said he and Kathleen had had a great time that night. They had went out, and then they went back to her apartment. And then he said when they were both in the bathtub, he just all of a sudden felt like choking her.
I remember smiling a little bit. And it looked like we were playing a game. Then I just shook my hands away and I actually said to myself, what are you doing? She's dying.
A week after Caroline interviewed Paul, he sent her a letter asking her to talk to the families of the victims and see if he could put flowers on their graves. Caroline did not want to be a messenger between him and the families to help Paul feel at peace before he died, so she didn't talk to the families about this. On June 12th, 1998, Paul died in the Oak Park Heights prison at the age of 53. A motive for why Paul attacked the women has never really been known. Paul claims to not really know why he did it.
I'm trying to find out the reason why you'd pick somebody up at a restaurant. 15 minutes later, you're stabbing them to death. I don't know why.
Though he did say he heard a voice in his head telling him to kill.
You don't know how many times I just sat in dark alleys or
go back to the street and just sit there and just talk, and thought. I mean, what is going on here? There was somebody telling me, Paul, it's time to kill. Paul, it's time to kill.
It is thought he might have been acting out revenge on the girlfriend who had left him to go back to Syria. The only picture detectives ever found of her, she was wearing a piece of red clothing in it. Paul attacked women who were wearing red, so who knows if that was significant. It does kind of make me think of bulls because aren't they triggered into rage anytime they see the color red? I can't think of the name of the people who hold that piece of red fabric and wave it to try to get the bull to charge at them. But that's what I have always thought of hearing about Paul attacking women wearing red clothing. Like, did he see red and it set off that violent rage in him? Or is there more meaning behind it? Why did Paul call police after the attacks? Some people think this was due to him being truly remorseful since he was such a devout Catholic. They do think that's why he made a full confession, because he was dying and he basically wanted to repent for his sins. Paul did tell police that after one of the murders, he went to a Catholic church, sat in the back pew, and cried. In one of his phone calls, he says something about how he knows he'll never get into heaven.
Calm down.
Some think Paul was just pretending to be remorseful. The FBI profilers did think that the killer was somebody who liked to play cat and mouse games with police. One psychologist noted that Paul did seem to like to be in control. Like when he made those phone calls, he told police where they would find Karen's body. He would tell the dispatcher what to do. Don't talk, just listen. Some think the reason he confessed was not because he was trying to absolve his sins before he died, but because he wanted credit for all of the attacks. Serial killers and mass murders do seem to want to become famous for their crimes. I really wish there was more known about his upbringing and his life before he started attacking women, just to kind of have a better idea of what drove him to do what he did. One thing that's for sure is Paul was an extremely violent person. To beat and stab people as many times as he did, you have to be full of an enormous amount of rage. That's all I have for this case. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.